My father returned from Grandma's funeral and said in her voice, "We need to talk." When he walked in, his heavy boots squelched against the wet linoleum in the hallway, a shuffling sound that immediately made me shrink into myself, just as I had as a child. Dirty water dripped from his black coat, which reeked of damp earth and cheap church incense, forming a murky puddle right at the threshold, but he didn't even try to take off his shoes or brush himself off. I stood in the kitchen doorway, gripping a dish towel so hard my knuckles turned white, waiting for him to start screaming about unwashed dishes or the lights being too dim, his usual ritual after any stress. But instead of yelling, he slowly raised his head, looked at me with empty, glazed eyes, and suddenly opened his mouth. What came out wasn't his smoky baritone, but the rattling, creaky voice of the late Grandma Rose. "We need to talk, Claire. You know I'm not happy." I felt cold inside because this wasn't just an imitation, it was a precise, terrifyingly accurate copy of the intonation of the woman we had buried just 3 hours ago. I froze, feeling the blood drain from my face as a high-pitched, nasty ringing began to rise in my ears, drowning out the sound of the rain outside. It felt like some wild, grotesque joke, but my father's face remained absolutely motionless, like a mask molded from gray wax. He sat in silence, staring at the blank wall where an icon used to hang, his breathing heavy and wheezing, perfectly mimicking Rose's asthmatic attacks. I was afraid to move, terrified I might break the spell or, conversely, provoke a fit of rage, but the silence was becoming unbearable, pressing against my eardrums. Finally, he spoke again in that same alien, vibrating voice that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You must not accept the inheritance, dearie. It would be a mistake, a big mistake." The words dropped into the kitchen silence like heavy stones, and I realized that this entire performance, all this mystical horror, had a very specific, material goal. My father, who had never cared for his mother while she was alive, was now using her dead voice to manipulate me into giving up the only thing she had left me, this old, beat-up apartment in the suburbs. But did he actually believe what he was saying, or was this the cold, cynical calculation of a madman? Memories of childhood washed over me in a suffocating wave, blending with reality and making me feel like a small, defenseless girl facing a massive threat. Frank had always been a master of psychological warfare. He didn't hit Mom or me, no, he destroyed us with words, looks, endless silent treatment, and gaslighting. Grandma had been my only shield, fragile and unreliable, but a shield nonetheless, behind which I hid when he came home in a foul mood and began methodically criticizing everything from my grades to Mom's hair. Now that the shield was gone, he had decided to use her memory as a weapon against me, knowing I loved her more than anyone and that guilt was my greatest weakness. I stared at his hunchback, trying to understand, was this still my father, who had lost his mind from grief, or was I sitting with a monster who had finally dropped his human mask? The next 2 days turned into a viscous, surreal nightmare where the boundaries of reality blurred by the hour. Frank practically stopped breaking character. He wore her old knitted cardigan that smelled of mothballs and peppermint, drank tea from her chipped mug with his pinky finger extended, and constantly muttered something unintelligible under his breath. I locked myself in my room, propping a chair under the doorknob, but I could hear him walk. On the 3rd day, he cornered me in the kitchen when I was trying to make a quick coffee while he was, I thought, asleep in the living room in front of the TV. He appeared behind me silently, like a ghost, and I nearly dropped my cup when his hand, cold and clammy, landed on my shoulder. "Claire," he croaked in Grandma's voice, "you have to sign the waiver. The papers are already at the lawyer's. I arranged it. It will be better for all of us." In his eyes, usually a murky gray, there now I tore myself away and ran out of the apartment, gasping from panic and the fresh autumn air that burned my lungs with its cold. I needed to see someone normal, someone to confirm the world hadn't gone mad, so I drove to the lawyer whose contact I found in Grandma's papers. The attorney, An elderly man with a tired face and ink stains on his fingers listened to my disjointed story carefully without interrupting, only occasionally furrowing his brows. He pulled out the folder with the will and showed me the text, the apartment, the summer cottage, and the savings. Everything was left to me, with no conditions or clauses favoring my father. Frank came to see me a week ago, even before Rose passed, the lawyer said, taking off his glasses and wiping them with a handkerchief. He tried to prove she was mentally incompetent, but I have a certificate from a psychiatrist dated the same day the will was signed. So, he had started his game back when she was still alive. It wasn't sudden insanity, it was a cold, calculated plan. When I returned home, I felt the atmosphere in the apartment had shifted. The air was heavy and electrified, like the calm before a storm. Frank sat in the living room surrounded by old photo albums he had gutted, scattering pictures all over the floor, creating a chaos of memories. He looked up at me, and for a second, I saw not Grandma, but that same cruel tyrant from my childhood, before he pulled the mask back on. "You went to the lawyer, you wicked girl," he hissed, copying Grandma's manner of scolding me for bad grades. "You are shaming the family. You want to leave your father on the street like a dog." He stood up and began slowly advancing on me, kicking the photos where Grandma and I were smiling, happy and carefree. That night I didn't sleep, lying in the dark with my eyes wide open, listening to every rustle through the wall. I heard him pacing from corner to corner, muttering, sometimes breaking into his regular voice full of malice and curses, then switching back to falsetto. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me freeze, the mechanical click of a cassette tape rewinding in an old player, followed by Grandma's voice, real, alive, recorded on tape. "Frank, son, why are you so cruel to me?" it played from the speakers. Then my father repeated the phrase, trying to match the intonation, over and over, like a diligent student. He was training. He wasn't possessed, he wasn't clinically insane, he was an actor rehearsing his greatest role to break me psychologically. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I wasn't dealing with a sick old man, but a calculating sociopath. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen with a face that showed no trace of fear, only cold determination and fatigue. Frank sat at the table, picking at a bowl of oatmeal, a dish he hated but ate because it was Grandma's food. Seeing me, he started his broken record about the ungrateful granddaughter, but I cut him off by loudly slamming the kettle onto the stove. The situation escalated. He began moving to direct threats disguised as the dead woman's prophecies. He said if I didn't sign the papers, misfortune awaited me, fire, disease, anything to scare me. I noticed he started locking his room, something he had never done before, which made me think there was something important in there, something he was hiding. When he left for the store to buy another bottle of vodka, which he now hid in the toilet tank, I took a hairpin and went to his door. The lock was an old Soviet model, and it took me only 3 minutes to pick it, feeling like a burglar in my own home. The room greeted me with the smell of stale sweat and tobacco. Piles of papers, bills, and IOUs covered the desk. It turned out Frank had racked up massive payday loans, likely had. Among the papers, I found a notebook filled with his small, jerky handwriting. It was a script. A literal script for his performance, listing Grandma's phrases, her reactions to my possible objections, even stage directions like, shed a tear here, or, pause, clutch heart. It was so cynical and vile I almost threw up right there on the papers. He had planned everything, from... I heard the sound of a key turning in the front door. He was back earlier than I expected. I had seconds to decide, run or face him. I shoved the notebook into the waistband of my jeans, covered it with my sweater, and walked out into the hallway, trying to look scared and submissive, just as he wanted. Frank entered, rattling bags, and immediately fixed me with a suspicious, drilling stare, as if he sensed something was wrong. "You look pale, Claire," he said in that loathsome, creaky voice. Grandma is worried about you. I forced myself to lower my eyes and mumble something indistinct, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs, ready to burst out of my chest. I needed a plan, a final strike to destroy his game once and for all, and that evening, I set the table, placing a bottle of vodka and 2 shot glasses in the center, a gesture of reconciliation he couldn't ignore. Frank sat down, eyeing the alcohol greedily, but kept up the act, crossing himself before drinking. I switched on the voice recorder on my phone, hidden in my apron pocket, and sat opposite him, looking directly at the bridge of his nose. "Dad," I began quietly, "I'm ready to sign the documents, but I need Grandma to give me a sign that this is truly her will." "Grandma, tell me, that money, the 10,000 that went missing back in '98. Did you find it?" I asked, holding his gaze. Frank faltered for a second. This wasn't in his script. He began to improvise, his cheek twitching nervously. Yes, I found it. I forgave him, and you must forgive too," he said quickly, stepping into the trap of his own greed. "Grandma never knew about that money. Until her dying day, she believed burglars had taken it, not her own son." "Strange," I said, my tone shifting to hard and cold. "Because Grandma died convinced we were robbed." "You just confessed, Dad." His face twisted. "You little brat," he screamed in his real voice, cracking into a shriek. "You think you're so smart." I walked over to him, stepping over the shards of the broken shot glass, and looked down with a mix of disgust and pity. "You have 24 hours to pack your things and get out of my apartment," I said, enunciating every word. "If you don't leave, I'll take this notebook and the recordings to the police and file charges for fraud and incitement to suicide, which you planned so diligently." He began to whine, crawling on his knees, trying to grab my legs, switching back to Grandma's voice, but it no longer looked scary, just pathetic and repulsive. I yanked my leg from his grip and went to my room, locking the door twice, leaving him to howl in the hallway alone. The night passed in silence. In the morning, when I came out of my room, the apartment was empty. Gone were his coat, his dirty boots, the smell of booze and cheap tobacco. He had even taken the old TV and Grandma's silverware, a final petty theft for the road. I stood in the middle of the ransacked living room, where photos and scraps of his script littered the floor, and for the first time in a long while, I felt my chest expand, letting in air. I threw all the windows wide open, inviting the cold wind to blow out the musty stench of lies and fear that had soaked into the walls over the last few days. I started cleaning, methodically throwing away everything he had touched. His old clothes, his mug, even the stool he sat on while playing Grandma, it all went into the trash. I scrubbed the floors with bleach, wiping away the traces of his presence as if performing an exorcism, but a domestic one rather than mystical. With every bag of garbage I threw out, I felt lighter, as if I were casting heavy stones off my shoulders. I found the death letters he had hidden and burned them in a metal basin on the balcony, watching the fire devour the paper, turning his debts and his power over me into gray ash drifting into the sky. A week later, I changed the locks. I installed a heavy, expensive door with reliable deadbolts, which became the symbol of my new life, close to him forever. A neighbor told me she saw him near the building entrance. He looked like a homeless man, drunk and dirty, shouting something about an ungrateful daughter, but no one listened. People walked past, turning away, and he dissolved into the city bustle, becoming just another shadow. I felt no guilt, no regret, only the dull calm of a survivor who has weathered the storm and made it to shore. 6 months later, I finished renovating the kitchen. The walls were no longer the dingy yellow of Grandma's time, but a light gray. The furniture was new and functional. No carpets, no old cabinet stuffed with crystal. I sat at my new table, drinking coffee from a new cup, watching the rain outside. For the first time in my life, I felt like the mistress of my own home, without looking back at the shadows of the past. The phone on the table chimed, a message from the bank about my salary deposit. Life went on, measured and clear. And only sometimes, on the darkest nights, did I think I heard a creaky voice from the hallway. But I would just roll over and go to sleep, knowing that ghosts don't exist, there are only people, and some